Which happens in hello. Anyway, I'll return the table to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome you to the March lecture? And a particular warm welcome is extended to any new members who may be attending the lecture for the first time, and any non-members who are attending. Before I make the formal introduction, can I go through the usual rigmarole of saying, please have your mobile phones either switched off or turned to silent. I now turn to the speaker. Roddy MacPherson, at the age of 20, he tells me, was secretary of the Oxford University Heraldry Society, which has a claim to be the very oldest in the country, founded in 1835. Makes us the new boys on the block. It had several refoundings since 1835. In 1983, he remembers that the patron was the Earl Marshal. The honorary vice presidents were John Brooke Little and Conrad Swan. And the senior member, Michael McLagan, who was not only then Richmond Herald, but had been the first Slains Pursuivant of the modern era, was also the vice president. At the tender age of 23, Roddy signed the Lion Court officer's roll for the first time upon his admission as a messenger-at-arms. Having served his first 25 years in that position, he was appointed Lion Macer in 2012. The office is always held by a messenger-at-arms, and he followed in good company. In 2018, he became Falkland Pursuivant Extraordinary, with promotion to ordinary status coming in 2021. That was when, wonderful to say, he found himself the fifth and newest, but not necessarily the youngest, of the HSS Heraldry Society of Scotland's current members to be unicorn pursuivant. Anybody who's heard Roddy speak in the past will know that you are in for a treat this afternoon, and it gives me the greatest pleasure to ask him to come and address it.
Thank you, Chairman, President, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start by acknowledging the beautiful misprint on the screen. That is to say that the writing was not by unicorn pursuivant, but by butte pursuivant. I'll give you my first slide. Dunnottar Castle, the place of the granting of the Charter on the 1st of April 1426, and a motto at the bottom associated with the great Earl Marshal George Keith. They have said, what say they, let them say. Now this sexacentennial oration may be rather long, and I have pruned my title by just one word, not for reasons of brevity, but for of accuracy. And therefore, if you compare and contrast the title that appears in the term card with what you see on the screen, the word I have cut is pursuivant. Now, of course, marshalled, musings, I've shown you Dunnottar. There's a pun here because to get through a long lecture, I shall need a sense of rhetorical arrangement, the marshalling of my arguments. And at the very start, the exordium, let me tell you, by the time I come to perorate, is there a doctor in the house? You will know not just that we're near the end, but that I should have said some things that are really rather brave, and thereby quite in the character of the subject of the Unicorn, Guillaume Leclerc, the Norman's Divine Bestiary, dated to just after the year 1200, says of the unicorn, "This beast is so daring that it will pick quarrels with elephants. It is the fiercest beast in the world." And you'll realize that there's a bit of daring do in what I am about to do. Now, long ago, when I was first told that I was to be appointed Lion Macer, I learned it was under a certain condition, and this was a condition imposed upon me by a lady who will remain nameless but had the alias of Lion Clark. And she said, "But what you must do is you must write about the list of your predecessors in the office." And so it came to pass that after attending the Heraldry Society, it was at the 40th anniversary event, and hearing Charles Burnet saying, oh, he was working on a list of all the officers of arms, I could feel Elizabeth nudging me to volunteer to get on with creating the list, for no list had ever existed before, so far as we know, of the Lion Macers. How very different, but you'll see, talking about Butte Pursuivant, you'll see that beards are making a comeback at the moment. But how very different when I find myself, so happily to find myself promoted from being a messenger at arms to being an extraordinary pursuivant. Nothing was said about how I needed to write up the list of my predecessors. Hadn't it all been done anyway? And looking at the Lion Court website, I've stolen this from the Lion Court website, a list of the Unicorn Pursuivants since 1426. There's that year again, starting with John Fraser in 1426. And I'll end here with Robert Fraser, and it's the only time that two Unicorn Pursuivants have had the same surname, by my counting. We've one of the famous five of the myth of gathering of unicorns is Adam Bruce, and how appropriate we should have an Adam Wallace so high up on the list, and he was a grandnephew of some sort of the great patriot Sir William. Mr. Anon, there are quite a few of the name Anon you'll find in the list. What more to be said? Now, 1507 is very interesting because Thomas Pettigrew of Mordendside, I might call it Magdalenside, Lord Lion until around about 1542. But according to Charles's book, the Thomas Pettigrew, who was Unicorn Pursuivant, died on the 21st of July in the year of grace 1507. So there must be, according to Charles's book, two Thomas Pettigrews, and Thomas Pettigrew of Magdalenside can't be the one who was Unicorn. That is really, in a sense, rather interesting, because by my calculations, no one who has been Unicorn has ever become Lion. Now, just going down. Oh, William Hardy, yes. Oh, he's of interest to me. He's the first one who went from being a messenger at arms to becoming Unicorn Pursuivant, and it was a William Hume who was the one immediately before me who went from being a messenger at arms to becoming Unicorn Pursuivant, and he died in office in the year 1707. So that's we take a long time scale here. Let me see. Oh, Thomas Barry, 1570. Well, he was ordered to have his hands cut off for forging the regent's signature, and then Robert Fraser, and this is as far down the list as I'm going to go. John Malden's biography is quite safe, of Sir Crispin Agnew's home life. I shall say nothing at all. Adam is safe, and I'd asked for Liam Devlin, we should have needed an entire symposium to discuss these gentlemen. So that's it. What can we say about Robert Fraser? Well, Alistair Campbell of Airds, the late Alistair Campbell, Sir Crispin's successor as Unicorn, he gets an honourable mention here because this is what he writes in his History of Clan Campbell about that Robert Fraser, Unicorn Pursuivant. "Have at the lion," was the cry, and with 3 lance thrusts the Gordons killed him at, that's October 1594, at the Battle of, call it the Battle of Glenrinnes or call it the Battle of Glenlivet. That is the battle. You're all speedy readers, aren't you? I can go right ahead. Anyway, with my sense of rhetorical order, narratio, they have said. We start with a charter in 1426. I am hugely indebted to the University of Aberdeen collections, who were able to find the charter of 1426, who photographed it, knowing that I was going to speak to you, and allow me to show you the founding document for our 600th celebration that we will all be dealing with on the 1st of April. The charter was first published, a transcription of it in 1862 in the Spalding volume, a splendid volume, Illustrations of the Topography and Antiquities, Aberdeen and Banff. Not without some. Let's go on to that. And we know it's the charter of John Fraser. At this point, marshalling and musings. There's a pun there. This is another time for a pun because the Frasers, of course, have on their arms phrases, strawberries, and usually they have but 3. But I like this from Sir David Lindsay of the Mounts Armorial because it shows 5. But going back to this book, the transcription has caused some problems because although it writes out that it was granted in the year Sexto 26, the charter is headed up Anno Domini 1427, and that's caused quite a bit of confusion. I've seen learned articles in the transactions of the Buchan Field Club saying there are 2 charters by which Robert de Keith, the Marshal of Scotland, gave a charter to John Forrest relating to the lands of John Fraser relating to the lands of New Forest. But so far as I can tell, there is only 1 charter, and the confusion is simply over the date. This is a piece about the Frasers of Forest, taken from Fraser of Philorth's book, The Frasers of Philorth. He was the owner of that charter at the time in 1879, and from his comments, I can understand he knew what he was talking about, and he had difficulty in being precise about the origins of this particular John Fraser, who is of so much interest to us. To the charter itself. Liam Devlin and I pored over the charter as far as we could and realised that reading 15th century charters is a specialist task. I could see that the Spalding Club transcription printed the word as unicorn, VNICORNN, and I could see that it didn't end NN, I could see it ended IJ, unicorni, And I wondered if that changed the meaning, and I'm very grateful to my friend Colin Kidd, a professor at St Andrews, who put me in touch not just with Michael Brown, the professor of medieval Scottish history at St Andrews, but with Michael's wife, Margaret Connolly, who is the professor at St Andrews of paleography and codicology. So I have been in the hands of experts in the reading of this charter, and I wanted to find out, I have to speak to these people, does it definitely say now called unicorn? And that is indeed the unicorn word, is the last word that you can see in the top line. Fraser is abbreviated. Nunc, there's one letter is missed out, and as it were, shall we call it a tilde, goes back to show that there's an abbreviation. Vocato, which is easy to read. Unicorii, and the tilde, which sweeps back from the right and sweeps back confusingly, touching the top of the C, which certainly confused me, shows that the N is missed. But Professor Margaret assures me it does say now called unicorn. And when I said, but what about the fact that the ending is EE, does that change the meaning? And she said, no, it doesn't. It's in the ablative. It follows the correct case, and it just means now called unicorn. There are other, of course, very interesting and important things to mention about the Charter, because the Marshal, Robert de Keith, calls John Fraser our dear consanguino, our dear cousin, our dear relative. So that's an important word. Also, a very important word, Pursuivant. The very last word on the Charter is Pursuivant. Not in Latin, which would be signifer, but is Pursuivant. And that word on the very last line follows after the word Alishe. Alishe. So Alishe Pursuivant. And the name before that is Giorgio de Murray Alishe Pursuivant. According to Charles's book, this Alishe Pursuivant, who is only known from this charter and from the King's confirmation of it, doesn't have a name. He's just called Alishe Pursuivant. But whether George Murray might have been his name, we could discuss. The Vizier, what say they of pre and post 1426? I'm going to go no later than 1485. That is amusing. That is a flight of fancy on my part, because I didn't really need to go so far as 1485, but I want to speak to you about two Jones, you see, two Jones, and that allows me to mention 1485. So I could have got a better photograph from my engraving of William the Lion's Great Seal, but there's William the Lion, and who so famously did not have a lion on his great seal. They have said, what say they? Let them say. What I want to discuss is everyone who speaks to me about, oh, you were the unicorn person, what's that to do with William the Lion? Wasn't he the first to have introduced the unicorn? It's absolutely full. The internet is full of mentions of William the Lion introducing the unicorn. And I thought, it's such complete nonsense. Where did this nonsense come from, mentioning the name of William the Lion? I was about to console myself as this was the only way I could sort of explain it. I'm going to do James Balfour Paul's wonderful lectures, history, heraldry in relation to Scottish history and art, mentioning that William the Lion popularly getting the credit for having the first to introduce heraldic bearings into Scotland. and this assumption, and I thought, is it just a very common assumption that if somebody introduced the lion to Scottish heraldry, there must have been a unicorn too, because you can't have the lion without a unicorn? I thought, well, it's strange. It's not much of an argument. But then, by providence, I kept at my reading, and an article in the Proceedings of the Antiquaries 1889 came to my rescue, and this is about heraldry on display formerly or presently at Marischal College, and the librarian of the university, within the University of Aberdeen, and obviously in reference to an item which had been donated to Marischal College's little museum, which opened in the 18th century, speaks of a carving. Now, I haven't got a slide of this carving, but Charles Burnet, I think, used to include it in his talks about the unicorn. It's carving, it's the full achievement of the King of Scots. The unicorns are regardant, which is interesting to us, but that's not the point of mentioning it. It's a carving, and it shows the shield, and it shows the supporters, and the supporters are unicorns. And Mr. Anderson writes, this carving is now disfigured by the ridiculous inscription. And the inscription says, this plaque found in the Exchequer Row of Aberdeen, erected by of arms in the Exchequer Row of Aberdeen, shows the arms of Scotland erected by King William the Lion, who died Anno Domini 1214, presented by Thomas Lindsay of Berryden, he even put his name to this, 1799. So there we have it, this nonsense about unicorns being introduced by William the Lion goes back, at least, I can vouch for it, to the late 18th century. And the cause of the confusion, could it be possible, was that on this plaque there are initials, VR, which the Aberdonian sources believe to stand for one William Rolland. And they make out that he was a moneyer to James V. James V didn't operate the mint in Aberdeen. James III was the last to mint coins in Aberdeen, but that's beside the point. William Rolland, and so somebody has seen initials and saying, well, V, that could be WR, it must have been King William. So that's a bit of nonsense to add into all of this. Now, this comes from an interesting little. It described itself as a brochure called The Unicorn, a mythological investigation by one Robert Brown Jr. Very accessible on the internet and published 1881. And what he's what I've put on the left is his quoting from a letter from the year before publication. This is from July 1880, and in the footnote we discover this letter, obviously written to the author of this brochure about unicorns, is Thomas Dixon. I assume this is the Thomas Dixon, the curator of the historical department at General Register House, noted antiquary. You will have seen his stained glass window in the Queen Street building. And what he says is that the Lion King of Arms, that would be George Burnet, who examined the stone at Rothesay Castle last summer, believes that it's contemporaneous with that part of the building, which they thought to be dated from the reign of Robert II or Robert III. ladies and gentlemen, everything that the distinguished Thomas Dixon says in this piece is to some extent incorrect. He then mentions the dates of the coins, the unicorns, not quite right, and then he goes on to say that the first time there was a unicorn Pursuivant was in the reign of James III. And I thought this is very strange that every piece of this we can now see from our modern understanding of the records is incorrect. And then I thought, no, think again, unicorn. Thomas Dixon was writing 2 years before the publication of the volume of the Exchequer Rolls, edited by George Burnett. So the records that I'm going to show, or one of them, from the Exchequer Rolls, which show quite clearly a unicorn Pursuivant, signifier regis, much earlier than the reign of James III, may not have been known. So it gives one an idea of what may have been the informed opinions from this amazing period in the second half of the 19th century, when so much was being catalogued, indexed, and published. On the right, a photograph of the armorial stone above the gateway at Rothesay Castle, where you can just about make out the two unicorns. And of course, it doesn't come at all from the time of Robert II or Robert III. And there's the brochure that I was telling you about, a mythological investigation. And I'm giving credit to that because I thought the letter from Dixon was interesting. And there's another part of his book. Most of it is not relevant at all to our subject, but I found it very suggestive. And from the point of view of giving me the topic of martial musings, I found it useful. Well, there's that carving again, and there's another carving. It's not from the castle of Rothesay, but it's from the St. Mary's Church in Rothesay, and that I put in just to remind me that the contributor of that piece to the Society of Antiquaries publication of 1831, the good Mr. McKinley, writing from Rothesay, and he mentions the castle stone, and he says, but it could have been inserted much later. It is, after all, adorned with thistles. And I just thought this was a letter from him that was read at the Antiquaries in 1825, showing that Rothesay Castle's inscription, carved stone, couldn't possibly be the earliest example of the unicorns, and Mr. McKinley had already said it in 1825. And now, in terms of, this is narratio of what they have said. They have said that King James I, that poor King James, captured on his way to France at sea, imprisoned in England for 18 long years, but he was allowed to write poetry whilst he was in England. He was allowed to get married when he was in England towards the end of his time there. And this verse 155 from the King's Choir, and well, the Lion King, not a reference to Lion's predecessor, but the beast, the lion, the lioness, the panther, the little squirrel full of busyness. Oh, and so it goes down, and not just the lynx, but the luffer unicorn that voides venom with his ivor horn. And that means the lover unicorn that empties venom, the antidote to venom, and he does it with his ivory horn. More will be said on the subject. And then looking to, again, what say they? 1426. Now, I think in Charles's lectures on the unicorn, this would be presented as the earliest known example of the unicorn as a supporter to arms in Scotland. This is an impression from a seal. It's only known from one impression. It's on a document, an indenture of 1439, and the seal definitely belongs, indeed says so, the Queen of Scots, and you might all say, well, it's obvious that this is a queen because look at the lozenge, isn't that obvious? But this is an aside. It's not obvious at all that a lozenge means that it's a woman, because just look at the coinage of King James I. His golden dennies, 9 shilling pieces. The arms of Scotland are shown on a lozenge. And that's the close-up from the photograph before. It's not very crisp, is it? And we'll discuss later whether that shows you the ivory horn from the forehead of this amazing beast, the unicorn. And then coming to the Exchequer Rolls and 1445, this is what I've promised to Beverly Bergman, a mention of her famous house, and even a mention of her favorite song. We're talking here about some pounds being given from the ferns, the rent from the lands of Gask. This would be the land of Gask in Strathern, to Unicorn Signifier Regis, to Unicorn Pursuivant of the king, this grant being conceded to him by the king. So when in Gask, it always reminds, oh, the old who's, what though the rooms were we. And you'll be hearing it sung to you so often, Beverly, but you weren't expecting to have it sung to you at the Heraldry Society of Scotland, where it was like, and that's just a way of saying, even before the old house of Gask was built and was peopled by, shall I call them the elephants of Gask, if the elephants will allow me to call them that, it was perhaps the den of Unicorn, his income being drawn from that, from those particular lands. 1445. And then the unicorn signet. If you look up the Scottish National Dictionary and look at all the different usages of the word unicorn, you'll find a quotation from the Aberdeen Dean or Guild Court book, which mentions February 1460 entry, and this is granted by the king under the signet of the unicorn at Perth. So this amazing thing that the king does have a signet with unicorn, and you can see the motto, Tut a un. I think pro omnes pro uno, una, omnes pro una. I think it's anyway, but it says Tut a un, and there's a unicorn, and this comes from Sir William Fraser's second volume of Lennox, and printed in 1874. You see my point again about this amazing contribution to the literature of the subject in the second half of the 19th century, 1874, and it's a charge by King James III to Darnley to give up Edinburgh Castle, and it's 1482. The king finds himself without access to the Privy Seal, and so he uses what was the secret seal, the secretum of the Scottish king. So it was used in extremis in 1482 and maybe much older. I've already told you that 1460 rather, is already known from our dictionaries as being the use of the unicorn signet. And from the point of view of these secret signets of the Scottish kings, I much recommend you to the writings of Robert K. Hannay in 1936 about the development of the signet, and the signet on the right is a lion, and it's believed to have been used in the reign of David II. And there again is the illustration from Fraser's book, a unicorn signet in use in 1482. And then we come to the glorious coinage of unicorns, James the Third. Except it's a drawing from Adam de Cardonald's 18th century book. It's not actually a unicorn from James III's reign, and here from Lindsay's illustrations, the only one which is from James III's reign, so we believe, is item 25, where the legend, "Let God arise and his enemies be scattered," appears both on the obverse and on the reverse, which I've always thought was a bit of a clue that the unicorn was meant to be the reverse of the coin, but someone has liked it so much and decided that henceforth it should be in the obverse and should have the important role of bearing the king's titles round that. And that brings me to the two Joans, because this story about the unicorn emblem in Scotland owes so much to Queen Joan Beaufort, and we've already heard, was she the first to use a unicorn on her arms? And now to Joan Murray, the early unicorns and heavy groats of James III and James IV, British Numismatic Journal, 1971. And this is rather a lovely memory. Mrs. Murray, I remember, writing to me and saying, "Dear Mr. MacPherson, I always think of you as Roddy, but given the large age difference, perhaps you might not want to reciprocate." And I wrote back and I said, "Dear Joan." And so the point is, very talented numismatist who worked out the sequence of the issuings of the unicorn coinage, 18 shilling pieces going up to 20 shilling pieces eventually. And there it is, we have an Act of Parliament of February 1483 or 84, new style, and it's called a fine penny of gold. And this is why I wanted to come up to 1485, where she found a reference to a debt case, that she said a judgment in a debt case, and she says this is the earliest record of unicorns by name being known to me, 18th January 1485, new style, £12 in gold, call it unicorns. And if only I had thought, Dr. Garrick, to write to you and ask for the contribution of your own unicorn anecdote, where we realised that at this time the unicorn was absolutely a household word, if you were of a household where you might have had gold coins kept in your coffer. Now, the point where it's a lovely bit of the story. So I called her Joan, and all the world knows her as Joan, because long after she died, we knew we knew she had done something in the war. She never spoke about it, and it was a secret. It was a secret. And long after she died, I think it was about 2014, out came the film The Imitation Game, about the Enigma machine about the code breakers at Bletchley, about Alan Turing, and Joan Murray. It's Keira Knightley, or Keira Knightley is Joan Murray from that. So it's so all the numismatists in the world, our eyes popped when suddenly the Joan that we remembered had turned into Keira Knightley, who was engaged to Alan Turing. Now, remember, in terms of the rhetorical arrangements, narratio, they have said. So what have they said? I'm quoting Professor Katie Stevenson from the piece that will be so familiar to many of you, The Unicorn, St Andrew and the Thistle. Was there an order of chivalry in late medieval Scotland? So going back to 2004, the first time the unicorn was connected with Scottish royal business was in 1426, when James I appointed unicorn pursuivant, and the Crown used a unicorn signet for official matters between 1457 and 1462, and in extremis 1482. Well, I've shown you the Fraser's engraving of the unicorn signet from the document of 1482. I have it on the authority of Professor Stevenson that the records of the unicorn signet predate 1460, and she says it's 1457 is the date. This is all very interesting, and I'm taking that as authoritative. And I thought, well, here's my authoritative statement in terms of narratio. But a speaker for you, ladies and gentlemen's work is never done, because I realized that Professor Steve Boardman, Professor of Scottish Medieval History at Edinburgh University, had just published something highly significant and interesting. And I hadn't read it. I knew nothing about what he had written. A new book was published in Belgium earlier this year in January about Anselm Adornes, and heads are nodding. You know, our old friends, Sir Anselm. And this book will be of interest to you because one of the illustrations is the Heraldry Society of Scotland's plaque in St Michael's Church in Linlithgow. And chapter 8 by Steve Boardman is entitled Anselm Adornes, James III and the Unicorn Collar. And Professor Boardman's task has been to examine the use of the unicorn in the Stuart dynasty up to the time of James III. So exactly on my material. And at this point in the lecture, I'm not going to tell you too much. I'll tell you more. But at this point, I'll tell you, he would question, I think, unicorn pursuivant. He says of 1426, the marshal makes an appointment. It doesn't say that this is a herald. It doesn't say it's a royal appointment, but we know from subsequent documents, and I've shown you that document, and I sang at it, 1445, the grant of the Ferns of Gask to Unicorn signifier Regis, that James II definitely had a pursuivant of the king called Unicorn. And Professor Boardman says, but we know that every king after James I definitely had a unicorn pursuivant, and therefore it's reasonable to think it was both heraldic post and that it was a royal one. And that's what Professor Boardman has said, and that, I think, in terms of what they say, brings me right up to date. And he very, very kindly let me read the chapter of his book without my having to buy the entire book. Now, confirmatio, that's a handy word because that reminds me that there are two 1426 documents for us to look at, and I hope you think it is lovely to have been able to see the original from the 1426, which is kept in the Aberdeen University Library. To see the back of the document is fascinating. In a much later hand, someone had written 1427, so you can see how these mistakes were made, and people thinking there were two charters when there only was one. My friends, I have not been to look at the original entry in the Register of the Great Seals of Scotland, but have relied upon my photograph from my volume, the King's confirmation of the Charter. It is significant. It's at Auchter House in Angus. I will say more about that. Now, in terms of the wording, it's interesting. He doesn't say nunc vocato unicorn. It doesn't say signifier regis. It just says John Fraser called unicorn. It shows us all the witnesses who were there at Dunotter on the 1st day of April 1426, which we know to be absolutely the correct date, and we know that Wednesday is the sexacentennial anniversary of that very day. It mentions at the end George de Murray, then with a comma, Alizé, spelt differently, not Alizé, but Alizé, Pursuivant, slightly different writing, but again, it's Pursuivant, not signifier in this charter. So there we are. That adds to our sum of knowledge, and then we go back to this phrase, this verse from the King's Choir. Professor Boardman's work is excellent on the subject of the poet king, and in stressing in fact, what Steve Boardman said, he calls the unicorn an avatar of the courtly life, an avatar. That's perhaps a modern, rather a modern way to put it. And I'll leave it to your reading of Professor Boardman to get all the reasons why he thinks that that James I was very interested in the unicorn. This is where I'll hint, and before I come to my refutations, I'll hint to you that this verse doesn't convince me that James I is particularly interested in the unicorn. It's a bestiary. He goes through all the animals, and what he says of the unicorn, the lover unicorn. Yes, it is a lover unicorn, but remember also that the unicorn in legend can be tamed only by the maiden. So it's as it were, it's out of the unicorn's love for the purity of the maiden which allows the unicorn to be captured, and that saves us from the venom of poison by the horn, a horn of salvation. Reverend sirs, am I quoting Luke's Gospel? A horn of salvation. That's enough for me to tell you about my doubts about James I's engagement with the idea of the unicorn. But I did spot this. I thought, oh yes, and wasn't the unicorn Chaucer's crest? And when I looked into it, I found I was right. It is. Well, certainly it was the crest of Geoffrey Chaucer's son, and there are the effigies and the carvings available at his tomb. A frontispiece of an old Chaucer. You can see the unicorn. Well, in fact, I think we can see the unicorn at least twice. And Geoffrey Chaucer's father-in-law was a king of arms, after all. So it's quite important. Now, but why am I going off at this tangent about Geoffrey Chaucer? Because the last verse in the King's require is a dedication of the work to the poets Gower and Chaucer. Refutatio, let them say. Let them say. Well, Professor Boardman, you will be pleased to know, has been through the back numbers of Double Treasure, is able to quote Charles Burnet from Double Treasure in 1977-78 about Charles's piece about the development of the Royal Arms up to 1603, mentions that the Queens of Scots from the 13th century, that's David II's Queen and Robert II's Queen, had seals showing lions as supporters. This is the Privy Seal of King James I, and I think this is dated to around 1429, and he has lions as supporters on his Privy Seal. And what I haven't put in by way of a slide is the example that I think Charles thought to be the earliest example of the Royal Arms, showing the two unicorn supporters, which is manuscript number 195 in the University of Edinburgh's library. And it's been in Edinburgh University Library since the 1650s. It's a volume of 4 works by Virgil, and on one of the folios there is the drawing, and in Charles and Mark Dennis's book, The Lion Rejoicing, there's a line drawing of it, and the date of that, well, I think Charles's position was that the lion is the established royal supporter, so far as one can tell, until a time which he describes as before the middle of the 15th century. And looking at the online catalogue for Edinburgh University Library of this manuscript 1995, they speculate that because the book is thought to have belonged to the Princess Eleanor, who was James I's daughter, so daughter of James and Joan, whom we've been discussing, and her initials being P and L for Leonora rather than Eleanor. They'd say, well, it shows her arms. She married Sigismund of Austria in 1449. So, but the arms are not marshalled. They're not. She doesn't show her husband's arms. So it's possible that might be from pre-1449, which seems to be getting very early in terms of other datings that I've seen on the book. But there we are. This is what I would say what we've been seeing. But Charles also acknowledged his understanding that James I sometimes had the unicorn as a supporter, and the evidence for that can only be based on this, which first came to attention in George Seaton's book, and that's published in 1863, that there was a seal with possibly a unicorn. He doesn't say he thinks it's a unicorn, it's possibly a unicorn. He doesn't give an illustration of it. It's then illustrated in Henry Lang's supplementary catalogue of seals, and we're a great expert in the seals of Scotland with David Bertie here with us. This is taken from Lang's supplement of 1866, and Lang says it's a unicorn. His actual example has ended up in the British Museum, and the British Museum catalogue says a unicorn, it's either got a question mark, I think it's a unicorn question mark, or a hind. So perhaps only Lang was absolutely sure that it was a unicorn. Everyone agrees that the supporter on the sinister supporter is lost. It's just broken. You can't tell what it is. I'm not sure it's a unicorn, and at this point I was thinking, well, what say they? What had they said before? Remember at this time, although I was saying that the lion was seen to be the preeminent supporter of the Scottish arms at this time, not always. Look at the great seals. You can see the shield sometimes being borne by, well, the engravers turn it into little angels as the supporters of the great seals. That's a beautification on the left from Lord Bute's improvements to Falkland Gatehouse Tower, and that's Mary of Guelders, Queen of James II's arms, with a very fine angel as a supporter. So there's really quite a lot of variety in terms of supporters, but was there really a unicorn on Queen Joan Beaufort's seal? And I think Heraldry in Scotland, Stevenson is interesting on the subject. Stevenson, he just missed by 1 year being the unicorn in post during the 500th anniversary of the 1426 Charter, but I feel sure he would have taken a particular interest in unicorns, and he, as in giving a recension of George Seaton, of course mentions the unicorn, but he puts question mark in brackets after the word unicorn, and I thought, what did Stevenson think of that one impression of a seal from Joan Beaufort from a document of 1439? And I think I got my answer by looking at his plates, because he illustrates Joan Beaufort's seal on that plate, item 4. And he also puts item 5. Now that's the beautiful golden seal matrix, which was found in Kinross in 1829. It's been in the museum now since 1919. You can see that with the Beaufort arms, the border company, it makes it quite clear it's the Beaufort arms. If it's the seal of Queen Joan Beaufort, interesting, she doesn't bother having her arms on a lozenge on that occasion. She doesn't have any supporters on the seal with the gold matrix. And look what J.H. Stevenson has done by way of illustrating this vital seal upon which so much has been built and so much depends as the foundation for saying that there was a unicorn supporter used in James I's reign. He cuts out the unicorn from his picture, and that was just my little laugh about it. He would have emphasised the unicorn if he'd felt more confident. After all, John Horne Stevenson was his name. You could just see those ghostly unicorns floating on the page. Now, this is all part of my refutation of the accepted wisdom, and I bring you back to Dunnottar, the place of the granting of the charter to John Fraser by that great personage, the Marshal of Scotland, Robert Keith. And John Fraser, you already know, is a relation of the Marshal, and he's been granted the lands of New Forest, and this is for homage and service to the Marshal, and he's now called Unicorn. So, what were they talking about on that first day of April 1426? Draw up a chair, and I'm picturing them gathering in the buttery at Dunnottar Castle on the 1st of April 1426, and you know it's Dunnottar Castle because the chairs say so. I'm grateful to my pal Bill for going all the way and getting me photos of the chairs at Dunnottar. And there's a table, but it's not the table that I would have love to have shown you, because a famous thing about the buttery at Dunotter Castle is it had a table which for 500 years served as a marvel of hospitality and open house keeping. An amazing table. So I picture them sitting around this amazing table at Dunotter Castle. And this is just to assure you that table is really quite something. I'm not going to read that all out, and that's not Old Scots, that's an Englishman speaking, but perhaps it was a Bute Pursuivant of the day doing the spelling of the English. What we know is that English visitors to Dunotter in 1617 said, "Where is the famous table? We have heard tale of it in England." And George Keith, the Earl Marshal, brought them to the table, and we're sure they benefited because they had meat and drink, and they sat down at that the Black Stock of Dunotter, and they had meat and drink in abundance and never paid anything for it. And it's the gift that keeps on giving. And why am I showing you the arms of MacPherson, or as I should say, Clan Hatton of old? The Blackstock of Dunotter. In some cultures, they have totem poles, but this is a part of Scottish culture in which there is, or certainly was, a totem table. And that totem table was the Blackstock of Dunotter. And how marvellous that we have a chieftain of the Clan Hatton here in our midst with Doc Garrett, because that's the reason for showing the arms, which you'll recognise as Clooney MacPherson's arms. This is from the Foreman Workman Armorial, and I wish I could show you a picture of that table with the silver plate put on it with the great long Latin inscription, which describes how hundreds of years ago it had been brought from Germany, it had gone to Caithness, it had gone to all these places. It had even been in London, and then for 500 years it was at Dunotter Castle, where it was the scene of such hospitality and the like, and the gift of the Earl Marshal to his relative and friend Alexander Keith of Ravelston, who was so proud of this table. He, in 1766, bought Dunotter from the exiled Earl Marshal and acquired this totemic table, the Blackstock of Dunotter. And the stories told of it are, it was one huge piece of oak, mitred with later additions, and that whole piece of oak came from the ship which brought the Catay from Germany to Scotland, giving rise to the Clan Chatton. So altogether this afternoon we've had all sorts of amazing stories, many of which should be taken with a pinch of salt. And just thinking of those who are gathered round that table. So let's look at the witnesses. Pat Ogilvy, Patrick Ogilvy, Viscount, Sheriff of Angus, Walter de Ogilvy. Well, Walter de Ogilvy was the name of a son of Patrick Ogilvy, so perhaps likely to have been him. Alexander Lord Forbes, and so it goes on and down to our friend Alice Pursuivant with that. So who are these people? Well, Patrick Ogilvie. Sir Patrick Ogilvie is married to Christian Keith and is a member of the Marshalls family. So that sort of explains why he would be visiting. Walter Ogilvie, well, it's maybe not the one who was the Lord Treasurer, but there was a Walter Ogilvie of Ochterhouse, and he had a daughter, and she married an Oliphant, which might connect Ochterhouse and Gask, and Alexander Lord Forbes. He was at Beaujeu. He was at the Battle of Beaujeu, that great victory of the Scots army in France, 1421. And what would they have been talking about round the Blackstock of Dunnottar in the hall there? Also, let's go back. The king goes to Ochterhouse, which is the seat of Patrick Ogilvie, the Sheriff of Angus, and he goes there in the summer of 1426. Not a very usual place for the king to be granting charters from there, but interesting. It ties it up with him. And there you've been waiting to see some of the iconography of a maid with the unicorn. And I pondered to myself, and I can see that Professor Boardman, well, I hadn't read Professor Boardman's lucid account of how the unicorn is an avatar of the courtly lover. What I was thinking about was this amazing importance which is put upon the maid in this time in history, and it was being spoken about. It was being spoken about in the 1420s, much in France, because there were the prophecies, had they come from Merlin, had they come from Bede, about how a maid would be the salvation of France. And that certainly made me think, I must let them see my photograph of Joan of Arc, because in the Mighty Things, the Fate of Empire and the Fall of Kings, I thought, is there a French side to this? And then I realized they're dining in 1426. My friends at the Heraldry Society may think it's entirely irrelevant if I mention what goes on in 1429, but I shall still mention it. And that is that Sir Patrick Ogilvie, the Viscount de Dangus, is the leader of the Scottish army supporting Joan of Arc in her entry into Orleans and in the relief of the siege of Orleans in May 1429. An iconic moment in history. I remember my father went, it was to do with messengers at arms and huissiers, and he went to France and was at an installation of a French officer in the Legion d'Honneur. And my father came back and he said, it was quite amazing because they started playing Scots Way. And I was quite young at the time, and I got into this. And anyway, the answer I got was they play Scots Way because it is la musique militaire la plus ancienne de la France. And it goes back to Joan of Arc's entry into Orleans. She was surrounded by the Scots. They had pipers, and they played, according to the legend, Hey Tooty Tatty. That's where the battle, or the marching song from Bannockburn. Well, who knows? What say they? Peroratio. Unicorn what, and whose unicorn? As it's been acknowledged by some scholars, Professor Boardman, the 1420 Charter does not say this is Unicorn Pursuivant, although because James II definitely had a signifier regis called unicorn, it's reasonable to think we're talking about a unicorn Pursuivant. And then my other question, whose unicorn? Nothing says this is a royal officer, but there is a royal officer in James II's reign, so is it reasonable to assume that it is a royal officer? Well, I come back just the scene at Dunotter. Neighbour down the road is the constable, and there's been a slains Pursuivant since 1404. So the idea of such a great personage as the Marshal having his own officer of arms seems reasonable to me. And I think his Pursuivant would have been Alizé, we could pronounce it in that way, Pursuivant, who is the very last, the humblest person mentioned after all these great men and after the chaplain. Alizé Pursuivant is the very last person mentioned, and he's not mentioned anywhere else except in the Charter and the King's confirmation. But John Fraser is the relation of the Marshal. It says so. Now, Robert Keith's mother was a Fraser heiress, that's to say she didn't have any brothers. So if he's a relation through the Frasers, it's not a nephew, but a cousin of sorts. I showed you that extract from Lord Salton's history of the Frasers of Philorth. It's a bit of a mystery as to the exact origin of John Fraser, but all we need to know is that the Marshal calls him our dear relation, John Fraser. So what rank was John Fraser, and whose unicorn was John Fraser? Well, you know how I'm looking at it, that they're just going back, Fraser nunc vocato, unicorn, no mention of the title thereafter, Pursuivant or herald. Nunc, is there some sense of immediacy that the King's Charter, the King's confirmation of the Charter, according to the published transcription, doesn't mention nunc. Was there some importance of the immediacy of the event going on the 1st of April that you're now called unicorn? And Alizé Pursuivant and consanguineo. All these key words that I call to your attention. And now, the young rhinoceros or real unicorn, can you get mixed up between a rhinoceros and a unicorn? Is it possible? Not in the days that we are talking about. I took myself to Hereford Cathedral so that I could give you a photograph from the Mappa Mundi, and it would show you the drawing of the unicorn. The one on the left is the original. The one on the right is an edited version to allow you to see it more clearly. There are two animals, and the rhinoceros has got its horn there, and the unicorn has got its horn there, and you couldn't possibly, if you met them on a bright day or a dark night, you couldn't possibly mix them up. They are different animals altogether. And this is where I must say that little brochure by young Mr. Brown, published in 1881, I found suggestive. And he gave that quotation from the Song of Carlaveric. And the Song of Carlaveric is a very courtly poem from around the year 1300, the siege of Carlaveric Castle. I think we have no, I don't have my slide of Carlaveric Castle there, but this is a tale of two castles. I don't count Rothsay as being really part of the tale. It's Dunnottar and Carlaverick that are the castles that I'm counting. And Carlaverick is as strong a fortress as can be found in Scotland, and it is being besieged by the English, and all the English knights are there. And Robert, the Lord of Clifford, who is the hero of the poem, and he may have commissioned the poem because adulation comes at a price sometimes. Let's see. To whom reason gives consolation to overcome his enemies. Every time he calls to memory the fame of his noble lineage, he calls Scotland to bear witness that he begins well and nobly as one who is of the race of the noble Earl Marshal. Well, let's just see his descent. And Robert Lord Clifford was the Marshal of England for a brief time, 1307 to 1308. He may have arranged Edward II's coronation. He was removed from office as Marshal, but later that year got a new job as Captain and Governor of Scotland. He was killed at Bannockburn. And Robert Marshall's predecessor, Robert Keith Marshall, predecessor, the Scottish Marshal, was also a Robert Keith, was at Bannockburn, doing what marshals do best, which is leading the cavalry, which was done. So there we are, and quite interesting in these days where we think that the patrilineal line is important. We are talking about Robert Lord Clifford's mother's mother is Lady Maud Marshall, who is the daughter of William Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke, and William Marshall is the greatest knight there had ever been. There's a huge long poem about his life. He was the prototype, some say, of Sir Lancelot, and even the as it were the suspected intrigues with Guinevere and Lancelot. It all sort of fits the life story of William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, and Robert Clifford is obviously very proud of letting it be mentioned that he is descended from William Marshall, the English Earl Marshall, Earl of Pembroke. He came to be called the Earl Marshall. Those are his arms. Oh, well, yes, it's a lion. It's a lion. And what did the bold William the Marshal do when he was out on crusade? Those quick readers amongst you will know what he did. Carlaverick, there. Slide out of place. Anyway, A Tale of Two Castles, Dunnottar and Carlaverick Castle. What he did, as one of those of the noble Earl Marshal, meaning William the Marshal, who beyond Constantinople fought with the unicorn and struck him dead beneath him. I found that very suggestive. That event in the life of William the Marshal is not recorded anywhere else but in the Song of Carlaverick. It's nowhere in the long poem of his life. I found it very interesting. I think it tells it in terms of all the comment that we get about, oh, well, William the Lion introduced the unicorn to Scotland, which is nonsense. It's not nonsense to say, as Professor Boardman used the phrase, an avatar of Christ. Avatar. It's not wrong to give emphasis to the connections of people's perceptions of the unicorn as being Christ. But that cannot be how it was meant in England at the time of William the Marshal on crusade, killing a unicorn. This, I think, is the meaning of the unicorn. He is so daring, he picks quarrels with the elephant. He is the fiercest animal in the world. And it's his ferocity and the difficulties in capturing him, and then going back, who can't bind the unicorn? Only someone truly great would be able to have the wit to be able to ensnare a unicorn and make him be of service. And so my bravery in standing before you with a thesis is compare and contrast and seek the differences that show up Scotland more glorious against the example of England. The English marshal, what does he do? He kills the unicorn. The Scots marshal, in his own flesh and blood, brings to life the unicorn. A post still flourishing after a fashion. This little, it's not a penny, it's not a halfpenny, it's a farthing. And this is one of the most exciting things that turned up during my lifetime, I think, in looking at the developments in Scots numismatics. It's a lion. You can see it's a lion. And this is a farthing from the reign of King Alexander III. And the first time anyone had seen a lion on a Scottish coin was on the Golden Noble of David II, when he's standing with his shield, and we see the lion rampant. There was not a suggestion, not a hint that such a coin had ever existed. A coin of Alexander III with a lion on it. There's nothing written anywhere. And a metal detectorist, one fine day in a meadow in Suffolk in 2015, found this coin. The point of that is, it is amazing what turns up. Perhaps the matrix of Queen Joan's seal, the one with, is it a unicorn, will turn up, and perhaps it will convince even the most skeptical, such as this unicorn in front of you, that it was indeed a representation of a unicorn. Or at the very least, perhaps more impressions will come from documents of the day. I'm with Professor Boardman when he rather nicely says of Queen Joan's seal with the unicorn, it takes appropriately imagination or faith in the beholder to see a unicorn. You'll forgive me, but these are after all my marshalled musings on the subject. And so in Perth's exhibition about the unicorn in 2024, what a joy it was, and to find myself as the little old me, a centre of attention and guides there saying, are you really the unicorn? Are you really? Can I take my photograph with you? So it, of course, is the privilege of a lifetime to find oneself personifying such an office as that of unicorn pursuivant. I'm hugely grateful and humbled to have been allowed to have stayed long enough in the job, as long as I get to Wednesday, to be there on the 600th anniversary of this crucial charter, which in fact, I hope you feel, opens up all sorts of questions. Even if you think my answers aren't much good, I hope you have enjoyed the questions that I've been able to pose. And the question, when I join with my friends at the Heraldry Society at National Unicorn Day, and we stand around in the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle, and we see this great sea of little boys and girls, and Stanley said, "Oh, he's a real one. Go and speak to him." And what I always say, you would approve of this line. I say, would little boys and girls, would you like to be photographed wearing my hat? I said, well, I'll tell you about this hat. This is it's a special hat. It's called a bicorn, and it's, look at all this lovely feathers. What's the feather? I call this a panache of ostrich feathers. George Way of Cleaning tells me it's not a panache, it's a fringe. But I call it a panache of ostrich feathers. And this special hat, it's called a bicorn. Why do you think it's called a bicorn? And every once in a while, there's a brilliant child who says it's got two horns. It's got two horns. And then I say, do you think that's a sensible hat for a unicorn? And they say, no, you should have your own special hat. So you see, this is magic, isn't it? But and so thank you to you all. I have perorated. I've told you what they have said, and now Reverend sirs, if I may speak to you all from Psalm 22. Thou hast heard me also from among the horns of the unicorns.
What am I ever?
Are there any questions?
This is thank you. This is a question really to Roddy, and thank you so very much for an absolutely fascinating talk. The bestiary in Aberdeen, does that include a unicorn? And obviously there are other bestiaries, and again, evidently no one has ever seen a unicorn, and so stylistically a type is created, and then that type is copied. But do you know if any of the bestiaries from the 13th century onwards depicted a unicorn?
Well, thank you so much for your question. When I look at the clock, I realise I have occluded myself 1 hour and 25 Earth minutes upon your attention. So I have to assure you, you can't get that time back. What I was speaking of from Aberdeen was the plaque which had been in the museum. But are you talking about the now the bestiary I was talking about? William the Clark's bestiary does have illustrations, and yes, there's a lot of pictures, and indeed from the point of view, if you'd heard Liam Devlin on the subject of unicorns and can take it back into classical times, people have not been backward about coming forward and telling us just exactly what a unicorn looks like. And indeed from India there are gems with engravings of well, what sort of beasts are there, but the museums will catalogue them as being unicorns. They are rhinoceroses, and we leave it to you to decide whether it comes from the snout or from the forehead. So I think people did have a pretty strong idea of what they looked like. The difference between the unicorn like a bull or the unicorn like a horse is quite interesting. I made nothing about the horse-like nature of the unicorn, because that could have taken up another 10 minutes on the subject of the marshals and their specific role with horses. But that's because isn't the unicorn really meant to be a bit of a goat, and it's got a lion's tail? So that the heraldists have had their own rules about how you draw a unicorn. But yes, it's a subject with lots of pictures, and yet, cynic as I am, no one has really seen the unicorn.
Going back to your names, you say Alishay. Could it not be Isla?
I've seen that suggested. I've seen that suggested, and why I thought it could be Isla, because who knows? We don't know. But I tend to think that Isla would have been one of the titles which came from the Lords of the Isles, and that along with Dingwall and Kintyre, that's their prominence. So I thought actually that Alizé didn't fit very easily for me as Isla. But in terms of the names that we know of as officers of arms, it is closest to Isla as a word. Yes.
Roddy, that was brilliant. I think actually there are other references to Alizé. I'm pretty sure I've come across some. But in other charters, it quite clearly gives the name of the person and then says, now called Carrick or now called Rothsey. So it's not, I don't think the now is necessarily as instant as you were thinking. Certainly there are other charters with Nook or Carter.
And that's not their appointments. It's when they've been doing other.
Yes,
other
yes, you've got
tasks.
somebody now called such and such doing something or being paid something.
Can I ask, Roddy, you see the thing, this is back to the numismatics. You mentioned the thing for France. I was wondering, have you looked at the French seals and the French coins? I can't think of anything, because obviously we've got the sequence for the David II noble that comes from England, but then look back to the French coins of that sort of period, you can see the thing coming through. Your Alexander Farthing's completely thrown me. I don't know where to start actually with that kind of one, but I wonder if you've actually looked at the French coins of the thing, or the French seals, to see where the unicorn comes in, because to some extent, if the collaborative one refers to the unicorn, it must have meant something. To put in the reference to slaying the unicorn, it must have meant, I'm not sure of the date of that criminal reference of that. And I just wondered if you picked up anything from the French coins or seals.
No. I mean, I used to look at pictures of French coins and the studies of the écu, and indeed the gold coinage of Scotland owes much to the French. I know that, but I haven't found anything about unicorns.
It's particularly because what you said is exactly right. You know, the late 19th century, you know, a lot of that stuff was done, and really nobody does it. But you get the thing of St Andrew from the coins of Burgundy as well. You know, there's a lot of images. But
all I can say from the point of view of French, I thought from the unicorn signet, I thought tout à une. I thought, well, yes, the unicorn is feminine in French, so it could be. Devoted to one is Professor Bortman's translation. Professor Kidd, whom I asked, he thought all for one, and so it's like, but it's closer, I think, to the Latin omnes. And Alesi, I just thought, well, I don't know of a motto which mentions Alesi, but there are continental pursuivants who have just these funny little words, and I just thought, go to it, pursuivant. That's one way to describe it.
Fine, bearing in mind the time, if anybody wants to chat to Roddy afterwards, I'm sure you're going to be available. You could buy him a drink or whatever. Can I ask David Bertie to propose a vote of thanks?
Ladies and gentlemen, we have to thank Roddy for a fascinating insight into early 15th century Scotland and the origin of the unicorn officer of arms. I was quite fascinated at the beginning when you showed the motto, not quite the motto, but the saying of the Earls Marshal. Because for many years I was a curator in the northeast of Aberdeenshire, and the Great Earl Marshal family formed focal part of one of our displays at the Peterhead Museum. I was also intrigued by the photograph of two chairs which had the North Castle carved on them. We had one of those in our collections as well. We did a bit of investigation into that chair. And rather than being 15th, 16th century, it was actually made in the late 19th, early 20th century. On a steamship to North Castle. The seal that Roddy showed, which might or might not show a unicorn, it is a unicorn. All you have to do is look at that hind leg trailing down towards the bottom of the seal. It ends in a cloven hoof. That is a unicorn. Too many people show a unicorn with a horse's hoof. It's cloven. So Roddy, many thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm sure there'll be lots more questions coming your way.
You will already know that the committee have lodged a petition for supporters to our arms to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and we have invited members to become donors towards the cost. To date, nearly 50 people have signed up, but if anybody else wants to add their name to the list, we're hoping to close the fund by the end of the month or early April. You can see me afterwards and I'll let you have details as to how you can make a donation. The committee has agreed that the next lecture on Saturday the 25th of April should be designated the Mark Dennis Memorial Lecture. It will be held here in the Royal Scots Club, and the speaker will be Elizabeth Rhodes, and her title is St Andrew and Heraldry. I hope as many people will be able to attend to pay our respects to Mark Dennis. I've been asked to remind you that the Edinburgh Tartan Parade on the 9th of May will take place here in Edinburgh. The Society has, I think it's 20 slots? 25 slots. So if anybody wants to join the parade with their banner, would you see Stanley as soon as possible so that you can add your name to the list. The attendance book, I think, has been passed round, but if anybody hasn't had the chance to sign it, if you would do so before you leave. And finally, to remind you that tonight the clocks go forward an hour, so you get an hour less in bed tomorrow. And if you sleep in, you will miss church. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you again in a month's time on the 25th of April.